Univerzitní křesťanské hnutí je studentský spolek, který pomáhá svým spolužákům promyslet, prověřit a prožít křesťanskou víru.
I get to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. As Jeremy said, Jesem Jenka, is that right? No, I'm German. Sorry. That was my try on Czech. I'm very glad to be here with you. So that question of is the Bible sexist is actually, I think, a very, very important question. And the impression that many people have, at least when I talk to them, is that yes, the Bible is very sexist. It's a message of oppression and a message of discrimination for half of humanity, women. And they should subordinate to the man according to the Bible. They belong to the kitchen, and their only task is to have children, as many children as possible. And if you ask me, I would say, yes, there are parts in the Bible that are quite sexist, and yes, over the century, it has been used as a religious justification for female discrimination, for violence against women, we call that femicides, but also for structural injustice, talking about gender pay gap or other structural injustices. And all that in the name of the Almighty God, the Father, who created this rightful order and who serves as the archetype of patriarchy. Now, to be transparent, this topic is actually a very personal one to me. Firstly, because I identify as a woman. Secondly, because I also identify with many of the aims of feminism. And thirdly, because I work with women, part of my work is working with women who are survivors of abuse. A lot of them have survived sexual abuse, but also some of them have been spiritually abused. And some of them are actually telling me how their perpetrators have used the Bible to verify or justify the evil deeds they were doing, taking the Bible as like a justification for this. And that obviously makes me very, very angry, and I find it most disgusting. Now, if you are here and if you have experienced some of this, can I say I'm really, really sorry for this, and thank you for coming anyway. And then fourthly, why is this question personal? It is also personal for me because I'm a theologian, as was already mentioned, but I'm also a Christian, and that means this is not just my career, but it's actually something personal for me. Like faith for me has got an existential meaning for my life because I trust in this God, I share my life with him. Now that for many people is a contradiction, isn't it? And a lot of people say to me, how can you combine these two together? Well, I wasn't brought up as a Christian, so when I went on my journey towards faith, I did some research on this, and actually what I realized was quite interesting, that over the centuries, that yes, the Bible has been abused to justify violence against women, but it has also served as a source of inspiration for men and women alike who stood up for liberty and equality. So, mention the suffragettes. This was a women's rights movement, and they fought for the right of women to vote. And the initial source of their criticism towards society was actually the Bible. I'll say a bit more about that later on. Or if you take the Afro-American slaves like Mary Prince, she was born as a slave in Bermuda. She became an author and an abolitionist, so she fought against slavery and for the freedom of women. And again, she was deeply embedded in Christian faith and the biblical text, and that served as an inspiration for her and a source of strength. The Bible has got a long history of being forbidden by dictators and autocrats because they were aware of the fact that there is social revolutionary power, and they feared this power in the text. Now, that brought me to thinking that actually this text, the biblical text, has been interpreted very differently and actually very contradictory. It was used to oppress women, but it was also an inspiration to elevate women and to inspire equality. So that means for me, the question that I have to ask is, what is actually the interpretation that is valid? What is the interpretation that is true to the intent of the author? That's something we often find in the humanities. I don't know whether there are any literature students among us. I know there are 2 philosophers. So if you study humanities, we know that yes, text can be interpreted very, very differently. And especially if it's a text that collects stories and wisdom from different centuries, different ages, and different cultures like the Bible does. So I think it is a valid question to ask, is the misogynist interpretation of the Bible actually valid in light of the overall picture of the Bible, what we find there? Because you see, the Bible is the developing story of God with humanity. So the question I think we need to ask is, what is the direction of development of that story? What's the trajectory of the story, of the narrative? And is the sexist interpretation the interpretation that does justice to this development that we see, or is it actually an abuse of the text that is probably more influenced by a will to power or by different cultural lenses? Now, in order to find out, I would like to invite you to briefly look with me on the overall picture of women in the Bible, but also on the relationship between the sexes, and to ask that question, what is actually the direction of development in which the trajectory is pointing? Now, I guess most of you know that on the first pages of the Bible, we find in very poetic language how God actually creates man and women in his image. And that means together they reflect something of God as male and as female being together. So that means man can't do the trick alone. Mary Daly is quite a famous feministic theologian, and she said if God was male, then the man would be the divine. And I think she's absolutely right. If God was male, then obviously we could attribute some divinity or some higher value to man. But the Bible is very clear on the fact that God is not man. There's a verse in the Bible where God actually says, I am God, I am not man. And time again, you see female or stereotype female characteristics applied to God. He's talked of as a mother or a hen. So it seems very clear that God doesn't have a gender. Also, I think we need to note, that we have to consider the cultural context of the biblical text. So when you look at the other cultures around the people of Israel for which the text was written, it's always very clear that yes, there is one image of God, and the image of God is a man. He's the king or the pharaoh or the ruler of the nation. And then the Bible comes along and says, no, actually everyone is made in the image of God. Man and women. It's not just men, it's also women. And that is absolutely socially revolutionary. There's equal value and equal dignity, independent of gender, of status, of nationality. And that was absolutely counterculture in the time, absolutely revolutionary. So you can see there that from the beginning, even from the first pages, there's inherent criticism of hierarchy and of despotism. And then what follows in the Bible is actually the story of humanity in the world, in a world that is broken. And that is differently from how God had initially intended it to be. And in many ways, we see how the more the relationship between man and, human beings and God actually becomes corrupted, the more the relationships between the gender, the sexes, between man and women becomes corrupted as well. Nevertheless, in the Old Testament, we see women being described as prophetess and judges and leaders, so they really play an important part and they have important positions. But we also see in the narratives that it very openly and again very counterculturally critiques and talks about the destructive consequences of polygamy, for example, or the failure of the patriarchs. And it describes systemic injustice and how that systemic injustice increases the further people move away from God's initial idea. So there is actually an inherent criticism of hierarchy, of these structures within the narrative, because it talks about the evil consequences of it, which again was very, very countercultural at the time. And then when you come to the New Testament, well, most of us, I guess, know is the story of how God becomes a human being. He comes down to earth in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And this Jesus of Nazareth constantly stands up for justice. That's like his program. And he shows how God is always on the side of the marginalized and how he gives deep value, especially to women. And the way how Jesus deals with women is actually, again, is revolutionary different and absolutely countercultural. In a time when women were not allowed to leave even the house without a man, Jesus has got female disciples and he encouraged them to study. In a culture where a woman's task was to have as many sons as possible, please don't have daughters, but sons is good, and to preserve the honor of her husband, Jesus defends women who in an act of civil disobedience violate the code of honor. And he puts them up as a spiritual example. In a context where men wouldn't even talk to women in public, Jesus turns to women. He's got theological discussions with them. He meets them on eye level. And then he makes women the first witnesses of the most important event in history, namely the resurrection. And he even tells them to go and preach and teach about it to the man. Well, the list goes on, but that's all to say that the way how Jesus treated women is actually a true revolution in his context. And I personally believe that it was one of the reasons why they ultimately said, oh, he's stirring up the people and we've got to do away with him and kill him. And then when you look at the first church, well, people are very skeptical, especially of a guy named Paul, who was one of the writers of the New Testament. And he is really, everyone says he's a real women hater. And some of the stuff, when I read them, I'm like, oh, why? Why did you put it like this? But again, when you look at the cultural context, actually the image is quite different. For example, Paul writes about how men are the head of women. Maybe you've heard about that. That was a metaphor that was used a lot in the culture. So you can read about it in Roman literature, in Greek literature. The man is always the head of the women. Now, when you look at the Roman literature, the interesting thing is that there follows a long list of tasks that the women, therefore, have to do. Because the man is your head, here is everything you've got to do and how you have to behave to honor your head, blah, blah. Now, when you look at Paul, the New Testament, he also has got a list. But he's got a very long list for the man and how men should behave because they are the head. And it's not the stereotype thing that a strong man is supposed to do or how he's supposed to look like leading and controlling and having power and protecting women whether they want it or not, as someone said recently. But actually, the men are told to love and to serve and to give their lives. So that turns the idea of male headship at the time completely upside down. A German theologian actually said, Paul is putting the idea of male headship into coma by the way he lists it. And that is obviously a strong contradiction to patriarchy in a shocking and, for his time, very, very provoking way. In the early church, we see that women are leaders, that they even counted among the apostles, that they would teach. Rodney Stark is a sociologist at the University of Washington, and he's written a book called The Rise of Christianity. He wasn't a Christian when he wrote it. And he says the Christian population within the first early church grew faster because of the prohibition of birth control, abortion, and infanticide. So what they would used to do is, because obviously they didn't have the means to find out whether the baby was male or female, they would then just leave the female babies somewhere in the countryside, and they would be eaten by the animals or just left to die, basically. And then he says, since infanticide tended to affect female newborn more frequently, they didn't want the female babies, they only wanted male babies, early Christians had a more even sex ratio, and therefore a higher percentage of childbearing women than pagans. To the same effect, women were valued higher and allowed to participate in worship, leading to a higher rate of female converts. So what he's saying is basically the high view of female babies and of women within the worship, within the life of the early church, actually made the church really attractive to women. And that's why the church grew so much. So to sum it up, if you look at the bigger picture of the Bible, I think women have an amazing value and a true dignity like no other worldview would guarantee at the time. And I think it's the Judeo-Christian worldview that actually is the foundation for the idea of equality of all human beings, namely for the human rights, including women. And that was absolutely revolutionary. Now, some people might say, well, you know, if all this is so revolutionary stuff, why did God come as a man? I mean, you know, Jesus, he's a man. Why didn't he come as a woman? Because by becoming a man, he obviously confirms male dominance and, again, elevates man, doesn't he? Well, certainly it was abused in this way. But here's my thought. When you look at what Jesus' mission was, he actually stressed the fact that he had come to serve and to wash the feet of his friends and to give his life. And then the cross is obviously full devotion and dedication. Now, all these are actually features that we would normally attribute, stereotypically, to women. The main features of Jesus' mission are behaviors that are stereotypically associated to women. And if he had come as a woman, he would have reinforced exactly those stereotypes. Because it's a woman's task to serve and to wash and to be devotional and all of that. But because he came as a man, again, he puts this whole idea upside down. A classical idea of a strong man is put upside down through Jesus. The divine man is the man who serves and who enters the suffering and who cries at the grave of his friend and who shows weakness. And that obviously absolutely contradicts the male stereotypes and paves a new way for being a man. Maybe here we find one of the strongest critiques of patriarchy and machism that contradicts all forms of mastery and coercion. Jürgen Moltmann is a German theologian, and he said the cross of Jesus crisscrosses all fantasy of omnipotence. And I think that includes the fantasy of the omnipotence of patriarchy. Now, I think when we look at the evidence, for many centuries, we can see how the church, the Christian church in the West, has actually been more influenced by Greek and Roman thinking about women rather than by Jesus and the biblical teaching, because it has always been Greek and Roman thought that has seen women as being inferior to the man. And I do think that, yes, the church has got to ask for forgiveness to the women who have been marginalized on the church's account. And they also have to ask for forgiveness to God, because I don't think they have been true to God's calling to stand up against injustice. Now, the question that remains is Christianity actually good news for the female half of the world? My answer would be yes, and that's my experience as well. Yes, I think it is good news for men and women alike, and here's why. As I already mentioned, I think the Judeo-Christian worldview and the belief that men and women are made in the image of God is actually the philosophical foundation for equality and dignity of humanity. We don't find that in nature. If it's only the law of the strongest, then the strongest will always assert themselves. Jürgen Habermas is the most well-known living German philosopher and an atheist, and he actually said in an interview just recently that yes, the human rights are unthinkable without the Christian concept of human beings. But I think if we're all made in the image of God, and God loves us all, that gives the single mom in the slum in Uganda and the victim of sexual abuse and the elderly woman in the care home the same worth and the same dignity as any king or billionaire or president-to-be. And that means it's not only good news for women, but it's actually good news for anyone who's marginalized and victimized. Secondly, I think the revolutionary example of Jesus is a true inspiration. I find it a true inspiration to stand up against injustice wherever it occurs, especially when it occurs to women. And it is an inspiration that has, over the centuries, time and time again, transformed society. I already mentioned that I think Jesus is actually the most inclusive person that has ever lived. He has renounced violence. He redefines what it means to be strong. He was always on the side of the marginalized. And over the century, he has become an inspiration and a source of strength for many women who have fought for female rights, because they knew that Jesus was on their side. I've already mentioned the suffragettes who fought for the women's right to vote, and Helena Swanwick was one of their early heroes, and she, in her biography, she says, "Let there be no mistake, the suffragettes movement was not primarily political, even though they then achieved a lot of political things. It was social, moral, psychological, and profoundly religious." More recently, this is Rachel Den Hollander. She was a gymnast in the US sports team, gymnast team, and she was abused by her doctor called Larry Nassar. She was the first woman to speak up against him in public and to go to trial and to go to court against him. And that obviously took an immense courage, because this man had a lot of power. It was over 200 women that followed her and spoke up against this man, and he was sentenced to prison in 2014 so that he couldn't harm any other girls anymore. In her biography, Rachel Den Hollander reflects on what gave her the courage to actually speak up. And she said, "I knew that what he did was wrong. Even if the judge wouldn't have believed me, even if no one had believed me, which is often the case in the case of sexual abuse, I knew that this was objectively wrong before God, and that I knew that God was on my side, and that gave me the strength and the courage to face the trial and face my abuser." Today, she's an activist and a lawyer for human rights. Very similarly, Ashley Judd, I don't know whether you heard about her, she's quite a well-known actress, and she was one of the first women to speak publicly against Harvey Weinstein. And and thereby started or rekindled the Me Too movement. She's very openly, again, that her Christian faith is what actually gave her the courage to speak up against a man who holds such power. And then my third point and last point is that in the Christian faith, we actually find grace that is a foundation of our identity. Grace instead of the culture of achievement and success. In her book, History of Feminism, Antje Schupp, a German philosopher, talks about how the pressing question of women today is actually that feeling of shame. And she says, the feeling of shame to fail is big. Women blame themselves if they're not successful. This contains the right insight into their own responsibility, but there is no criticism of the system. So she's actually saying that in this third wave of feminism, we actually need to criticize the structures and the structures of our society and system, and that idea that everything is valued according to what you achieve. And we call that meritocracy. And I think she's right. I think that is very, very true. And feminism sees that as a manifestation of patriarchy, actually. Now, what feminists advocate for is that we no longer build our identity on and value on what we achieve, but that we go beyond our success as a foundation of our identity. And I think that is very, very true and a very important criticism. But the question is, what can give us the strength to move beyond? What can actually serve as a firm foundation of our identity if we are not just what we achieve? Well, I personally have found the best foundation for my identity in the unconditional love of God, because it doesn't depend on how good I am, how well I perform, or how successful I am. It's an unconditional love that He gives to all women, to all men, and to all human beings. And that, for me, is actually good news.